Okay, we better get started. Welcome everyone to the CARE seminar. We're back at home. The last time we had a seminar, I said, oh, hopefully we have one live soon, but that might not be happening anytime soon. I hope that you're all keeping well for this week. Today we have Dr. Erica Kuligowski presenting to us. Erica is the Vice-Chancellor Senior Research Fellow in the School of Engineering at RMIT University, and her expertise is in decision-making and response behavior of people and their imminent threat, emergency communications, and evacuation modeling. And over to Erica. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for coming today. I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully it's up, if you could let me know, Helen.
Yes, it is up.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Okay, hi everyone. As Belen said, my name is Erica Kuligowski, and I'm in the School of Engineering. I started at RMIT in October of last year, and definitely do not recommend moving during a pandemic if you're interested in reducing your stress levels. But I'm very, very happy to finally be here and joining RMIT, and look forward to sharing my research with you today on modeling household evacuation behavior during bushfire. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which the university stands. We respectfully recognize elders past, present, and future. Before I begin today, I'll just do a little outline here. I'll give a very brief introduction on who I am and then talk about my research motivation, but the bulk of the talk will be focused on current research that I'm working on, and then a little bit at the end on future directions. So, who am I? I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. I have a bachelor's and a master's in fire safety engineering and a PhD in sociology. And so what I've been doing for the last 18 years before joining RMIT is working at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And that is a US federal research laboratory. I was in their engineering lab there, and I was involved since the beginning in 2002 when I joined in looking at and studying disasters. And so I've been involved in many interdisciplinary studies where I've worked with engineers, social scientists, and other researchers who are interested in understanding various aspects of the disaster. For instance, the behavior of the hazard, its impacts on buildings and infrastructure systems, but I was primarily involved in studying the impacts to the people. And so the building occupants in the case of building events, and then community members in the case of tornadoes, hurricanes, and bushfires. And my goals there have been to understand the actions that people take to protect themselves and why. So that includes actions to shelter in place as well as to evacuate. And during these studies, especially the building studies, I've also used computer simulation models on how people evacuate buildings to better understand some of these what if questions. So for instance, in what happened in New York in 2001, in that investigation that I worked on, I was asking, well, what if the towers were full that day? What if they were completely occupied? Because on September 11th, they were not. So most of my work has led to changes in building codes and standards, guidance documents for buildings and communities on evacuation as well as emergency communications, decision-making tools as well, message templates for evacuation, and the like. So in the last 8 years, I've focused my research primarily on understanding household response to bushfires. That is involving identifying the factors that influence people's decision-making and their behaviors, as well as the role of emergency communication in these decisions. So I'd like to go a little bit into what my research motivation. So why am I working in this area? So the first thing was that a fire occurred in 2016, and this prompted almost 14,000 people to evacuate, caused 14 deaths and 191 injuries. And up until that point in the US, we hadn't lost as many civilians as we did in this fire, at least for the couple of decades before this. And this was also a unique fire in that it exposed a population that was not as familiar to fires and fire risks as populations maybe on the West Coast of the US. It was rapid fire spread. The fire was fueled by strong winds, humidity, and drought conditions. Um, the population had received a number of voluntary and mandatory evacuation orders, but some of these were hindered by complete losses of the communication services. And so therefore, people had told us in my study, my first warning was my neighborhood being engulfed in flames. I had no idea how very close the fire was to our home until I saw pictures on Facebook. And we drove through flames blowing across the road 3 times before reaching the bottom of the mountain. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. So 2 years after that fire, a fire occurred in California that this time killed 85 people. And people were talking about this as the perfect storm and that a number of things came together to cause very negative consequences. So first, this was a population with higher proportion of older adults as well as people with disabilities. The community had an evacuation plan. It was a phased evacuation plan. People knew their routes. They had practiced the plan, actually full-scale evacuation drills. But that plan had not necessarily been stressed until this event when there was rapid fire spread. 2 out of the 4 routes were blocked by fire, and people were stranded and actually trapped in the affected area. One of the interviewed survivors noted that the trees to the right of me were on fire. We were just dead stop. There was no one telling us what to do, anything. We were just sitting there. And that was, she was talking about what happened when she was actually physically on the road trying to evacuate. So these horrific conditions that people have to deal with in fires are not necessarily going away. More and more places around the world are experiencing these extreme fire conditions, as everyone on this call well knows, linked to climate change, people expanding into bushfire-prone areas, as well as fire exclusion. And the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry noted, and I quote, "It is clear that we should expect fire seasons like 2019 and 20, or potentially worse, to happen again." And additionally, last fire season prompted quite a number of inquiries, so both at the state um, and the federal level. And these inquiries identified gaps in our understanding. These are essentially kind of areas for more research related to evacuation. And in fact, the Royal Commission report has an entire chapter dedicated to evacuation. One of their recommendation prompts state and territory governments to update their evacuation plans to account for the actual behavior of all types of people exposed to various fire conditions, including under the worst case scenarios. So my initial research focuses on understanding how people decide whether or not to evacuate during bushfires, which to be honest, has been studied in various fires in both the US and Australia. But I was interested in understanding not only the factors that influenced the evacuation decision itself, but also the stages that lead up to that decision. So risk perception, for example. I'm interested in the factors that influence someone's personal perception of risk to loss of life or injury that then leads to the evacuation decision and the factors that influence that decision as well. So, most recently, I studied evacuation behavior in 2 different fires. One in Tennessee in 2016, that was that fire that I mentioned earlier with the population that was less familiar with fire and fire risks, and a more recent bushfire in California that happened in October of 2019 that prompted almost 186,000 people to evacuate, but had only 5 injuries. And that fire occurred 2 years after a very devastating fire called the Tubbs Fire occurred, where people did lose their lives, more than 20 people. So this is a population in this California fire that's very much familiar with fire, and actually the same population had pretty devastating and traumatic experiences 2 years prior. So my goal here was, can we predict decision making of households? What I did was develop a 20-minute survey that was targeted at households in both evacuation and fire zones. We asked questions about their previous fire experience, emergency preparedness, household and personal demographics. In the California fire, we asked specifically about their perceptions of safety provided by their home. How safe did they perceive their home to be in providing them safety from bushfire? The alerts and warnings, any kind of communications they received during the fire, any cues during the incident, their perceptions of those, and then what decisions and behaviors did they make and take. The analysis that I'll share with you today are the results from linear and logistic regression analyses. So linear regression to predict the risk perception levels, and the logistic regression to predict whether or not someone decided to evacuate. We've also, on the California fire, have been using machine learning techniques and technologies to predict these dependent variables as well, but that work is kind of ongoing, and I can't necessarily share it with you yet because we don't have our findings completed. So let's start with the results from the Tennessee fire. And first, with the factors that predicted risk perception. And I should say I have pluses and minuses here, but if you are interested in learning more, I have the article, the top right, that has the coefficients for our analyses and the significance values and such. But first, for the factors that predicted risk perception, some of them are very much aligned with previous literature, like seeing flames and embers led to higher risk perception, having a prior awareness of their risk, knowing what fires can do and what could potentially put them at risk, actually what led to lower risk perception at the time of their evacuation decision, which again falls in line with theory. But I want to talk about kind of those two in the middle. First, seeing and smelling smoke. So witnessing smoke actually resulted in lower levels of risk perception in this fire. And whereas that might be confusing, smoke is usually categorized as a pretty intense physical cue. However, in this case, the fire was burning for 5 days before the evacuation event occurred. And so we're proposing that smoke had an opposite effect in this fire. The disaster research has shown that people can become desensitized to warnings, for example, over a number of hazard events. So we posit that the same thing is going on here, and that people became desensitized to smoke over a number of days, right, within the same fire. And actually, Josh Whitaker and some of his work in Australian fires has found the same thing most recently. So hold off on explaining the warnings from a trusted source for a minute and dig into the logistic regression analyses. As we suspected, risk perception was a significant predictor of the decision. The same was true for gender, in that approximately women were 3 times more likely to evacuate than men. And those who undertook fire preparations at home were approximately twice as likely to stay than those who had not. Marginally significant was having an evacuation plan. So that was marginally linked to a decision to evacuate, as well as warnings from a trusted source. So whereas this, again, might seem kind of counterintuitive, why does that lead to negative risk perception but leads to evacuation? But I actually found the same result in my study of the World Trade Center evacuation, in that if people received warnings from a trusted source, they did not actually have to perceive higher levels of risk perception. They could perceive lower levels, not even perceiving risk to themselves, but still evacuate because they received warnings from a credible source. It's almost like they're skipping over that stage of risk perception and going right to safety because of the credibility of that source. So in terms of model fit, I just have some information on our screen about our R-square value for the linear regression model, and using cross-calibration to assess the model fit in our logistic regression, our model was capable of predicting 86.2% of the decisions. So we're currently analyzing the data from the California fire, that's the Kincade fire. I'm using both regression and machine learning, but I am seeing some interesting trends I want to share. So among some other factors that we're finding significant relationships between our independent variables and our dependent variables, for example, perceptions of safety of their home, number of adults in the home, having pets and livestock, residence time and home ownership. I want to kind of dig into what I'm showing on the screen in that we found receiving evacuation orders either from official or unofficial sources was a predictor of risk perception and evacuation in this fire. However, there was no relationship between fire cues and risk perception. And as far as evacuation, people who saw fire cues were actually more likely to stay. But this is most likely because respondents evacuated before the fire spread to their property, if at all, and seeing fire cues was most likely a result of staying in place. And people in this fire were responding even as early as receiving just a warning that they may need to evacuate and not waiting for the order to be given. And so, why is that? And an important aspect of this fire involves previous experience of the respondent. So, unfortunately, we were unable to test previous experience in our quantitative analysis because so many people had experience. We didn't have very much variance in that variable, but we did look to end of survey comments to shed some light on what might be happening here. And we'd like to use these to do further research, right? This isn't generalizable per se, but we found that previous experience can influence their awareness. So one of the respondents said that after losing our home in the Tubbs fire and evacuating in less than 10 minutes from waking up, I felt informed about the Kincade fire, right, the 2019. It impacted people's preparedness. One of the respondents noted that much of my attitude and preparedness is due to the more sudden and immediately threatening experience with the Tubbs fire, where flames were visible from my home. It also influenced their decision. There were a few roads out and they became gridlocked in the 2017 firestorm, so we prefer to leave proactively in 2019. And then finally, it also impacted departure timing. One noted that I was still traumatized by a much closer call in the 2017 Tubbs fire, so I did not hesitate to evacuate when the order was given. And what this shows is that we need to delve, and I hope to do this in future studies, we really need to delve much more into how previous experience influences future behavior. So household decision making during evacuation is just one of the many decisions that people and households make in bushfires along this kind of evacuation timeline. And unfortunately, there's very little data on these other decisions like departure timing. When do people leave? When do people actually enter the traffic network? What mode do they choose? Do they choose personal vehicle, public transport? What route do they choose? Is it a familiar route or is it the shortest route? And then destination, do they go to a shelter? Do they go to a hotel? Do they go to a family and friends? And complicating this are what's known as intermediate trips, and that people, when they decide to evacuate, they may take additional trips, maybe to pick up other family members or to pick up supplies or help other evacuees before they move to safety. Also complicating is some of the environmental cues that people may encounter during their evacuation that could affect route choice or the speed at which they move during evacuation. And without data on these things, planners, decision makers, model developers, and those are the models that people can use for planning or real-time decision making on evacuation, they all have to make assumptions about what people do. And a lot of times, these assumptions are that people optimize their behavior rather than what they actually do. So the assumptions are that people evacuate together as a unit at the same time, which is actually not all the time what people do, and what we found was not the case in the California fire. There are also assumptions that people all have sufficient capacity in the modes available to them, and for example, maybe everyone uses personal vehicles, where we know that this is not always the case. Other assumptions are that people plan ahead and take the shortest or the quickest route. And again, we know that that isn't always the case. From hurricanes, we know that people take very much their familiar route. There are assumptions that people stay on the route and comply with all traffic instructions. Also, assumptions that people distribute themselves freely among the shelters and that they evacuate only when their zone is ordered to and they drive directly to their destination. And we know that this is not the case, but it's important that we collect data, quantitative and qualitative data, to provide foundations for this. And when people make assumptions on this, they are likely underestimating the time that it takes a community to evacuate, the challenges and the hindrances that people may face during a bushfire, and in turn, potentially not sufficiently accounting for the types of assistance that people may need, their timing, and the types of evacuation orders, or the traffic management solutions that may be required. So I end with some of the things I'm working on now. I've been working with a team of researchers from the US and New Zealand to better understand decisions and actions that people take after they make their decision. So we're using GPS data to investigate evacuation trajectories across different socio-demographic groups to understand not only did they decide to evacuate, but when they left, what routes did they choose, and where did they go to reach safety. That's an international team I'm working with for folks from the US and New Zealand. And in the second project, I'm working in an international team again to develop a evacuation computer simulation model that links fire with pedestrian and traffic to estimate evacuation clearance times for planners and incident commanders who make decisions in the moment, to help them know who should evacuate and when. And we're also collecting behavioral and traffic data to validate this model as well as further develop it. And finally, I'm working with a colleague at QUT to study the efficacy of bushfire and flood visuals, so both videos and images, to promote knowledge about the hazard, elicit risk perception, and intentions to act. And so at RMIT, I'm hoping to expand this work and collect data in Australia on evacuation behavior during bushfires. So using larger data sets like GPS data or social media, looking into using VR and AR technology to collect data on decision making, as well as surveys and interviews with survivors. And I'm always looking for graduate students who are interested, and I'm always happy to participate on graduate panels as well on related topics. So thank you very much for your time. And I know I just threw a lot of stuff at you, but I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Erica. That was very interesting presentation at work.
Thank you.
So over to the participants, if anyone has any question. I cannot see any posted on the chat, but I can see someone raise their hand. So I'm just struggling to see who raised their hand.
Billy has her hand up. And,
oh, yes. And
Lauren as well.
Yes, okay. So Billy, please go ahead. Thanks.
Thanks, Erica. That was so interesting. Thank you. It's so relevant for us in Australia. The question I had, and I was really pleased to hear that you've got a communication research program happening, is given that people's experience is one of the biggest predictor of whether they act or not and when they act, could that be part of the communication element to it, that you're bringing in, particularly if men are slow to act? Well, women, you said, show that women were 3 times as more likely to want to evacuate, but could you bring in that into the ads, or the communication strategy, that you're actually showing the experience of other people as a way of getting people to act more quickly?
Definitely great question. And there's a couple things to that. There's definitely the opportunity to use some of these things to provide kind of more information on education and to target the communication both prior and even during the event. And I've actually been talking with CFA, for example, and how they want to start to create more targeted evacuation warnings and orders, for example, so that they're taking this knowledge and using it to kind of try to preempt what people are thinking and might do, and to help them get to a more safer decision at a quicker time and things like that. That's the first thing. And then also with previous experience, that's an important one. And also just kind of knowing that your neighbors and others are evacuating at the same time is another piece. And can help people make their decision quicker. So yes, I may have evacuated in the past, and these are my experiences, so that I need to evacuate now. But at the same time, if we can also show that other people in your neighborhood are evacuating during an event, that would prompt some people to do so as well, because of social influence and things like that. So thank you for a great question with a lot of different things we could unpack, a lot of nuances that are very important.
Thanks. We also have a question from Lauren and then Michael.
Great. Thanks, Erica. Fabulous presentation. And so delighted to have you working with us in CUR, bringing your very, very skillful quantitative analysis in. First of all, I just had a kind of, not a silly question, but just I was wondering whether you had a remark about the use of ships, military ships, in fire evacuation, since that was an interesting element of the Australian 2019-2020 fire. But more seriously, I was wondering whether part of the thinking about evacuation perhaps is a constraint, both for practitioners and people doing it, but also research, is a sense that it is this sort of quick transition. It sort of joins you from A to B, so it's a trip. Whereas what I'm gathering is that it becomes an experience in and of itself, and it can sometimes have incredible duration, and people get trapped and stay there for long periods of time. And just, yeah, your comments on the sort of thinking about it, just the notion of evacuation. It's about leaving, as opposed to sort of entering a different situation. Just wondering if you could comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for your questions. And first, the first one on ships. Actually, it's not a silly question at all. And I know some colleagues in Sweden they have a student project, kind of a start out project, to look at some of the alternatives to evacuating if a community is trapped, or if it's a one way in, one way out community. And so I think that's something that's really important to be thinking about for the future for some more isolated communities, or communities that can become easily isolated. And I think that was actually part of the Royal Commission report too, was to think about some of these alternatives to evacuation. So that's not a silly question. And then essentially the next one about extended, the actual duration, it is definitely not a flip the switch. And I think it might be something too that it is also in our minds as researchers, because a lot of the times we're focused on the decision itself, right? Okay, people make a decision to evacuate and we got it, and then they go immediately and they're safe. And there's so many things, right, that are important to be thinking about along the way, but as researchers, we're not collecting data on them. We're just collecting data on the decision and then leaving the rest to the planners and to the decision makers to handle. And the hurricane evacuation sector have studied these decisions along the way for many, many years, and have identified some real serious nuances where if people take the familiar route and they're all on that route, this could be a very long, extended duration, pretty traumatic process. So I think what I'm hoping to do is bring some of that information, knowledge to the field, right? Let's learn from these other hazards and start to really unpack. I hate that word. I keep using it to really kind of peel the onion on what are we really talking about here when we're talking about an evacuation timeline. Excellent. I'd love to talk to you more about that, because I think it's really important.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to ask your question or questions?
Hi, Michael.
You're on mute, Michael.
There we are. How you going, Erica?
Good, how are you?
Oh, battling on, up in the Dandenong, no fire risk.
That's good. Yeah, sure, you're fine.
Well, thanks for your presentation. It's just great that you're here doing this work. There's obvious big differences between US and Australian experience on evacuation policy, or the lack of it here. But I think your time here is a real opportunity to contribute to and inform Australian policy on evacuation, because it's one of the big problems here. What sort of views have you got on our approach, particularly in Victoria, on evacuation, and how do you think you might be able to maybe contribute, ideas to influence policy? Because I think this stuff ought to go to our policymakers. What do you think about what we do, and what do you think you can contribute to fixing it or improving it?
I love this question, but it's a tough one because I definitely don't want to be coming in and saying this country knows way more. But what I think I can contribute are a few things. And Josh Whitaker and others' work have shown that the leave early policy is only, it gets some people to leave, right? But there are a lot of people who wait and see. And we see the same thing in the US. What I'm interested in understanding here in Australia are how many communities are planning for evacuation. I've heard, and speaking just anecdotally to some of the local emergency management officials, is that there's so many fire scenarios, we don't even know how to make sense of the problem, right? We don't know how to bound it in any way. And that is, that's troublesome and a potential worry, because it's important to have this plan, to stress it. Durendra's on the line. He's working on with Surf Coast Shire and others about simulating some of these and stressing the plan. That is what I would like to bring to some knowledge to Australia, or anyone interested in working with me on the importance of developing plans and the importance of stressing plans, using computer evacuation models to do that, and then think about, okay, what if these things happen? How are we going to deal with them in the moment, right? There's always going to be something new that maybe you didn't think about, but if you can plan a little bit more for some of these worst case scenarios, then you're definitely more prepared for when these things actually happen. So that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to talk to local emergency management officials, understand how they're planning, how they're using computer simulation models, and then help them think about scenarios, both fire scenarios and evacuation scenarios, so we can start being a little bit better prepared for when these things actually happen and they get worse and worse.
Yeah, it's good. I went up to Steele's Creek. We didn't go there, but further up the Yarra Valley a couple of weeks ago, and that was an area that was burnt out in 2009, which you'd know about. And I spoke to some of the people up there, similar sort of talking to people that you're doing, and a couple of people were killed as the fire just came over the hill. They didn't even know it was coming. That was part of the scandal. But a whole lot of other people stayed and fought it, so you had this crazy, scenario of people dying when this fire suddenly appeared, and other people who were a little bit further away from the hill who stayed, and saved their properties, it's this chaotic kind of responses, with no policy, no kind of coordination, anarchic approaches, I guess you'd call it,
Well, I could talk to you for hours, Michael, and maybe visit the Dandenongs again.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Sorry, thanks, Michael. We're a bit over time. If Jago and Hannah are online, I can ask you whether I can take another question. Or
yeah, I'm here. Thanks, Bill. Now go ahead.
Okay, I should take a couple more questions.
I prefer to allow good conversations about research to continue rather than to unnecessarily curtail them.
Okay, so thanks, Jago. Durendra, you had your hand up, and then Adriana. Thank you.
Hi, Erica. Thanks for the great talk. And I mean, we've had plenty of conversations about other things as well, but one thing that came to mind listening to your presentation, and I'm curious about what you think about it, is how do you think, or if at all, the geospatial sort of or geopolitical boundaries actually make a difference to people's behaviors? Like, you've got a UK perspective and now somewhat of an Australian perspective as well. But I'm thinking also in terms of, for example, what happened in the 2019-20 fires, where between the Victorian and New South Wales boundaries, the way that people responded was very, very different, because they had very different data sources they were looking at. The apps they use are different.
Yes.
And there was no single dashboard, for example, someone could go to. You went to the Victorian one, it looked all red on this side and all green on the other side, which was, of course, not the case. So I'm just curious, have you found whether people across political boundaries behave differently?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And unfortunately, not for bushfires yet, but in the US, I did quite a bit of that for tornadoes responses, because their policies were very different, used different warning types and different. And yes, if people are used to kind of understanding, this is what I do when I see this, and this is how I react, and you get different information over here and different policies and different education, and you can get very different behaviors. And I actually know that Josh Whitaker has worked a bit in understanding that and behavior across borders. And I know also that they're, and I'm sure that they're trying to hopefully standardize or work together so that the information is the same across, because that's really what you're talking about. People are looking and seeing very different information, and so they're going to be reacting in a different way. I would love to, I'm coming from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, so I love standardized practices. But what I'm learning here about Australia is that the states are very different in the way that they do things, and maybe like it that way. But I think it would be fantastic to have some of these policies, especially mapping and information, a bit more standardized, if I could say the S word.
Yeah,
So,
well, they're going to at least standardize the messaging across the nation,
yes,
which is the start.
that's great. But also,
Thanks,
I
Erica.
think maybe through, I don't know, maybe some work standardizing the mapping too would be fantastic. I don't know if anybody's doing anything in that, but we can chat more about that.
Thanks, Yurendra. And one last quick question from Adriana. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Erica. Such a good presentation, as always.
Hi, Adriana.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Really quick question at the end. What do you think is the most urgent and the most possible transformation in this area? I mean, we talk about climate adaptation and the need to adapt, but with the expanding wildfire risk, we need to really start looking at transformations. So what do you think is needed from a transformation perspective, rather than just more of the same, better of the same? And is any of it possible? Gosh,
that's like, that's the end question, but probably maybe the hardest one, because it's whether or not we could do a short-term transformation and maybe see some short-term and quick benefits, versus longer term, we need more research and to be thinking about this broadly. And I think that's kind of what I've been maybe struggling with a little bit, is where can I focus first? Where could my research play a role first? But what I'm hearing is from at least some of the fire organizations I've been talking to, is really this goal of trying to have targeted messages. And I think that might be a first step in trying to transform the way we're thinking about getting people to respond. Maybe that could be a first step that we take, but I think also thinking about different ways in which we're planning for these. Dhirendra is doing amazing work working with communities, and he has a model that he's worked on for 8+ years, and communities are finally starting to use it in Victoria. So it'd be fantastic if there could be work in looking to see how other states are doing this, and how other states are thinking about using models and planning for evacuation. And as I mentioned, kind of thinking about how are we how are we looking at worst case scenarios? I think that's another way to transform. We look back, right? And with all of the work going on in climate, we have knowledge potentially of what are these things going to look like in the future. And so when we're talking about stressing the plan, we should be talking about stressing it for what is likely to come rather than what have we had in the past. And that is merging many disciplines together so that we can think intelligently about what we should be planning for looking forward. So gosh, probably not the best answer to that question, but something I've been struggling with and would love to chat with you more about it.
No, thank you. That's really great to get your thoughts. And yes, let's talk more about it.
Sounds
I'd
good.
love to. Great.
Thank you very much, Erica, and thank you everyone